Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Chinese Medicine Podcast. It's Marie Hopkinson here, welcoming you to a very special episode where I'm joined by two awesome people today, Waleed and Yassin, and they're going to be doing a channel takeover. So they're going to very quickly be taking over the channel and actually asking me the questions. They have been interviewing actually one of my teachers in classical Chinese medicine in the UK, Laurie Ayres.
The thing about classical formulas is you don't actually use a lot of herbs. So throughout time, there's been different materia medica, different herb books written and different formula books written over time. Classically, like the Shenong Bensajing, the first materia medica for single herbs is actually quite small. Then as you get into later years, you get like thousands and tens of thousands of herbs used, tens of thousands of formulas in formula books. But classically, it's actually quite small because you have these repeating structures, like if we look at the formula Guija Tang, which is to treat a Taiyang issue. The formula Guija Tang has multiple variations. It's one of the things people always talk about when they talk about the Shankan Learn, how there's like 70 or so variations. I can't remember how many exactly, but there's a lot of variations of Guija Tang. And a lot of them are just changing the dose of one herb to alter the emphasis a little bit. So you have Guija Tang. If you double the amount of Baishao in it, it becomes the formula Guija Jia Xiaoya Tang, which then treats abdominal cramping. If you then add another herb, Yitang, to it, it becomes the formula Xiao Zhenzong Tang, which is then actually nourishing the center and building blood a lot more, and it's much more cooling for the center. Whereas on the flip side, if you take the Baishao out of that formula, it becomes Guija Chu Xiao Tang, which is to treat an irregular heart. So you're actually reviving the yang to the point where the heart can maintain a regular heartbeat. So just with these little tweaks, you can really, as long as you understand the fundamental function of Taiyang and what Guija Tang is doing, you can understand these little tweaks because these herbs are all units reviving physiology.
And they're really interested in studying classical Chinese medicine. What's the difference between TCM and classical Chinese medicine? So we had a little chat and I said, why don't you come on the channel and take over and do a takeover? So we're going to do an interview where they're going to interview me. And there's probably going to be some questions that you've wanted to ask me about how I got into Chinese medicine and how classical Chinese medicine is different. I'm going to talk about the ICEAM system and how that's unique. And they've got some great questions. And I also wanted to point your attention to their interviews that they've been doing. They're starting up a YouTube channel and a podcast. We're going to put the link to that in the description below. And so you can click on there and find out more about that. I might post some of their stuff on the channel in the coming weeks to sort of highlight what they're doing, some snippets of that, and then you can go onto their channel and have a watch of it. So interesting. And I think that'll be interesting to you. So hopefully their channel does well. And I just wanted to give them a little shout out, and I'll let them take over the hijacking now.
Okay. Hi, Marie. We've been big fans of your channel for a while, and we have had all these questions, and we thought we'd just take over your channel for an episode and just ask you these questions ourselves. And we're really glad that you've allowed us to do so. Awesome. So we're going to switch off a little bit. I'll start, and then me and Yassin, or Yassin and I will alternate a little. So our first question is how you got into the classical medicine thing. We know you have a background in TCM, but we've also heard you talk about classical medicine, and it's fascinating stuff. And so we wanted to know what got you started on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So my teacher who taught me TCM, his name's Wade James. He was my main teacher in TCM school, and he was always searching for something better in school. Like when he was my teacher then, and I went and learned from him after that. Studied with him, I should say. Probably not studying with him is not the right word. I went and worked at his clinic, but I felt like I was still studying, doing that because he was always sort of coming in every week. So I used to go in there and work at his clinic, seeing patients once a week when I first graduated. And he would always come in every week and say, "Oh, I found this, I found that. This is a really great book." And he was always looking for something. What was the answer to these questions in Chinese medicine, which were kind of the unanswered questions. And that went on for about 9 years, and that was the hardest job I've ever had to quit. It was the only job I've ever had, but it was also the hardest job it was to leave, because it took me almost a year to leave there, because every week I would go in and think, oh, tell them this week I can't keep working here, but just because my own clinic was getting too busy. But I used to love being there. And eventually kind of decided I've got to sort of stop working here. And I didn't see Wade for a while. Like I used to see him, every so often because he had the herbal medicine company that I would get my herbs from. So I would see him, but like there was about an hour of distance in our city for me to travel there. And sometimes I'd go up there, to pick up my herbs and we'd have a chat and stuff. And one day he said to me, and this would have been probably, I don't know, ages past, and it's not like we'd connected every week or anything in that time. And he said to me, he goes, I've done this thing. And he didn't really tell me at the start that he was doing it. So he did Arno's course when it first came to Australia 3 years before I started it. And he said to me, Arno's going to start the course again in Australia. And as soon as it happens, you've got to sign up straight away because all the slots will be taken and you might miss out. Like he was so passionate about it. He was like, you need to email him right now and get on this waiting list. And I did that. And, I was like, Arno, there's nowhere to sign up. Wade told me I've got to kind of, he's like, it's the sign up page isn't even ready yet sort of thing. Because Wade had kind of, he had sold it to me for a few reasons. One is he said to me, this has changed everything that I do. And I didn't really understand that because I wasn't working in his clinic and seeing what he was doing at that time. But he also had he had already had 20 years prior to the 15 years he on me sort of thing at that point. And he'd already then sort of left all that behind to do something new is what I'm trying to say. So it kind of got my attention that if someone who's already a very good practitioner, so if I was sick, that's the person I'd go to, right? Like he was already the best person in my town that I could think of in Chinese medicine. If he was willing to give up, because you have to kind of give up the TCM ways to fully embrace the classical Chinese medicine system, then I thought, mate, there must be something to this because Wade was already very good at it. And now he's doing this and he's saying this is the best ever. And it was so great. And, so I was basically, that's how I got into it. I did it on his recommendation. I enrolled in the course. I paid the money. I went to the class in Sydney because I had to go to Sydney 3 times a year. Now I'm in Perth, it's a 5-hour trip, like on the plane every time. It's quite a lot of effort to do it. And it ended up being three times a year for 3 years to do the course. I just, from that first weekend, like I sat in the class, and it's the first seminar I've ever been to in Chinese medicine where I didn't check my phone the whole time. Like I didn't check my emails. I didn't, when you get into a seminar and you think, this fucker's boring or, whatever, like your mind drifts and you're like, what's going on in my other world? I didn't have that. I wasn't able to do that because I was so glued to what Arno was saying in the course and what was happening that like I was just literally writing down, like thinking I can't write fast enough to keep up with what's being said. And I couldn't switch my brain off of that. And that in itself told me that there's something to this because it's very rare these days that you find something where you're like, oh yeah, I've heard that before.
Yeah. We just had that experience. I've seen a lot of, you're talking about Dr. Arno versus Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
I've had that experience on YouTube, but we just had a conversation with Laurie Ayres, who's his student. And my body gets tired before my brain does. It's insane. I have a lot of things to ask, but I don't want to steal Yassin's question. So Yassin, go ahead.
No, I think we've got to a point where you're talking about how tuned in you were and to the theory and to these ideas being thrown at you. It's perhaps a good time then to talk about what advantages did you find in making this switch from TCM to classical, and did you feel perhaps that there were lacuna in in the approach, also these certain spaces that needed theoretical spaces that needed filling in that you found when you made this transition?
There's two parts to that. Two parts to that answer. I think one is you don't know something until you know it. You don't know you didn't know it, and there was a lot of that. There was like, I should have known this, but I didn't realize I didn't know it. I didn't realize there was a gap. and that knowledge was missing. Like, it wasn't sort of much the knowledge was missing, but the understanding, because there's a lot of stuff in Chinese medicine where you're just told that's how it is. And you just kind of like, well, you just have to believe it, kind of thing. And I teach my students this when I'm teaching them, because I still teach TCM stuff, right? And TCM is part of, like, classical Chinese medicine is part of TCM. It's not like it's a separate, complete different thing. It's just that one has sort of departed ways a bit more than the other, right? But there's some ideas where at the very start of TCM school, you're just told, just believe it. Like that Seinfeld, it's not a lie if you believe it, like just believe it and it will make sense to you eventually. And there were some things that once I started learning the classical system that I realized, those questions were never really answered in TCM. And I had just didn't realize that, like, for instance, yin deficiency would be a good example. Like the and this is going to piss a lot of people off and annoy a lot of people, a lot of TCM. What do you mean there's no yin deficiency? And that's not I don't want to hijack the conversation with that at all, but that's a big thing where it was never really adequately, properly explained how that pattern actually manifests and takes place. Whereas the explanation for those exact same symptoms in a classical Chinese medicine perspective was so articulately explained that it might just, there was a lot of what I learned, which was just like, oh, that makes sense. And it was easy to digest it for me personally. Like, yeah, I can't remember the other part of your question. Was there gaps that I didn't, guess, yeah.
No, I think that kind of does answer the question. And I suppose my other follow-up question would be like, is there an example that you can share a little bit around about what kind of thing? I mean, you mentioned yin deficiency. What was it that was clearer about that to you from a classical perspective? Terms.
So one is, in a classical Chinese medicine perspective, the treatment is completely different. So you kind of see the results in a different way because you're using completely different herbs. Like, for instance, you're using these warming herbs to treat this patient who's got a lot of hot and, heat kind of coming out of them, let's say. But what is that heat? That's the thing TCM never properly explained. What is that heat? So in classical Chinese medicine, they explain that as, well, that's your own body's yang, like escaping out, or like weak yang floats and strong yang is contained, that principle, right? So once that was explained, it was like, oh yeah, that can make sense. And there was there's a lot more other metaphorical explanations that were given to make that make sense as well. But in essence, like, when a person came in, so let's say a patient comes in and they've got hot flushes, menopausal hot flushes, right? And they're like, oh, I'm so hot and sweaty, and I can't stop sweating, and I just feel I feel irritable, I feel annoyed, I don't like the hot weather, and and they just get these waves of heat. Well, in Chinese medicine, they say, well, that's heat. Okay, it's not external heat, like sure heat from the environment, so it's deficient heat. But what is that deficient heat? They never explain that properly. Oh, well, it's just is deficient heat. Whereas in classical Chinese medicine, they're saying, well, that heat is your own body's yang. And that completely changes it, because it's like, you're not going to be killing your body's yang. Like, your yang is your life force. And why would you sort of flush that away or try to push that away? You have to take that yang and put it into the place where it belongs, rather than just use herbs that are kind of like trying to reduce the heat. That's something that was that's a completely different concept. And it was almost like I remember, this is a bit off track from that, but like maybe the second or third week of coming back from the course, faced with a patient where I thought they've got a sore throat, for instance, and in TCM, you're going to give them all these cold herbs, because you're going to give them for herbs, you're going to give them like a yin chow san formula. That would be the stock standard thing to do. And I was sort of like shaking inside, thinking, oh, will this ginger make them, what if it heats them too much? Because you're kind of told, like in TCM, if someone has heat, never use other heat, like never give them more heat, like stay. And even in China, like I've been to China probably 11 times on different trips and stuff. I love China. And you can go down the supermarket and there'll be a whole bunch of teas that are just called keep away heatiness and things like that. Like there's just this hate of heat, but it's never really explained what is that heat. Like even if a person gets a cold and they have a sore throat, what is that heat? Is it the environment? Is it actually the environmental heat? It's not. Otherwise your whole body would be on fire or something weird, right? Like it'd be like breathing in hot air. That heat is your own body's yang. It's just it's in that place to try to heal that area because there's like inflammation there or whatever. But that was never explained very well in TCM, but in classical Chinese medicine it was like, oh yeah, okay, well that makes sense. Makes sense.
So that sounds like you've got a completely sort of different understanding of the of the human body and the things, how the processes in it work. And I think just from listening to your videos on classical medicine, I've really gotten that sense, which is part of what got me interested in this whole thing. The other thing that I guess we were wondering about is, what about your understanding of the herbs themselves or the formulas? It seemed almost from listening to you and from listening to Dr. Arnaud and from listening to Laurie Ayres and a bunch of other people, and even in other lineages, that there's a very sort of different understanding of how to use these herbs, and that it's somehow more systematic to learn and therefore kind of easier to learn almost, if that makes sense. Did you find that?
Yeah, all those things are true. Yeah, and to the point where sometimes I've come back to teach TCM herbs. I don't teach that like right at the moment, but sometimes I've been asked to teach that at the college where I teach or something, and I'm like, oh man, like I've even told the students, man, this is really hard. It seems really even more complicated looking at it from this, like, you know, learning it, then learning something else, and then coming back to this. Yeah, so there's a few different things, like, because I guess a lot of people watching this are going to be thinking, should I study this system? Like, is this something I should study? And if you've already learned a bit of TCM herbs, or you've already learned them in there, it's that knowledge isn't wasted. But for one, there's just definitely less herbs used, right? Like I have a vintage suitcase and I can fit all the herbs I need in that vintage suitcase on the top and bottom layer, right? So because I had to do some mobile work last year. So I put all the herbs in there. Now there's probably about 6 different herbs. Like these are all granules. They're all taking up about this much space. So there's about 400 Chinese medicine herbs in the Materia Medica roughly. And there's probably about 150 in the that are used in the classical system, particularly in ICEAM. And within those, there's probably about maybe I'd say something like 50 or 60 that are like your stock standard. And what that means is you can never ever run out of guaja. You can never run out of baishao or something like that, because you can't substitute these herbs for other things. They do what they do, right? And then there's some specialty kind of herbs that aren't used very often that you might stock. But from a stocking perspective of your clinic, it means that you don't have to have as much stock there. Like if you're setting up a new clinic, like it's cheaper to stock your dispensary with less product there. But what that means is you get really familiar with guaja because you're using it all the time. You're not sort of like only ever sometimes using it. Like you'd use it every day. So you get very familiar with certain herbs because you're using them a lot. And there's a lot in your question about that. The way the herb system is taught is a completely different way to TCM. One is the herbs are all categorized according to the 5 elements. And I really like that because I've always liked the 5 elements. I've always found that to be easy to understand. And for me to think, oh, this herb's a wood herb or this herb's an earth herb, that was never mentioned in TCM. Now that's something that is proprietary to like the ICEAM system, like the lineage system. And that's something that I think Arnaud Versluis has taken from he's formalized that in a way that's easier for people to understand, right? But I don't know exactly what he was taught. I don't want to say the wrong thing here, but he is masterfully sort of put that in a system that students can then understand and use. But that's not something you buy a Materia Medica or a Bensky Formula and Strategies. they don't talk about herbs being wood herbs or earth herbs or stuff like that. So that is a unique part of the system. And, you know, then the way you learn the formulas, you kind of learn about certain, like the first formula, let's say, like, say for instance, a Xiao Chai Hu Tong, or a Guija Tong is probably a better example, because Guija Tong's like Guija's like the start of the herbs. Most people consider that like the start of all the the birth of Chinese medicine. And then there's all these formulas that are kind of like, if there was something taken out of Guija Tong or something added to it, or, you know, something taken out and two other things added, and it's kind of modified in that way. So it makes it easier to learn, rather than just in TCM school, you're just sort of like, I don't know, given these categories of herbs and formulas, and you're just like told to memorize all that. They don't give you a way to memorize it. They just go, here, learn all this stuff.
So we've been addressing the system theoretically in terms of, and conceptually in terms of the things that were left opaque by TCM that are now become clearer. You've mentioned heat and so on, and the systematic nature of herbs. Now, did you notice a shift in clinical effectiveness? What was your experience then clinically, taking on this new understanding, these new theoretical insights and so on?
Yeah. So there's two things that I have to mention about this system that doesn't exist in TCM. One is, in TCM, if you give a formula and it doesn't do what you've asked it to do, what you think it's going to do, like either the patient gets worse or nothing happens. In TCM, you have no idea what's happened. You don't know, did I feel the pulse wrong? You might not have even felt the pulse if you're just doing TCM, right? You don't know, am I right or wrong? That gives you no information, almost. I don't want to say explicitly not, because there's some very good practitioners in TCM and they're probably great. So keep doing what you're doing, and, you know, I don't want to poo-poo all over them. But in general, if you, maybe not straight away, so when you first start learning, you're obviously not sure what you're doing as much as, you know, when you've been doing it further along. But there's a clear sort of path forward, or a much clearer path forward. If you give a formula, the patient will either get worse or get better, and sometimes they'll have like no result, but most of the time it's kind of either of those two things. And not that I'm saying you give formulas to try to make people get worse, but if that happens, that's really useful information for you, because it teaches you about what that formula is doing and what your pulse diagnosis was. Like, there is that part of that contained in this system that I'd never found that was a part of TCM. They were just sort of like, I'll choose a different one, or, you know, that kind of thing. The clinical results I got was heaps better. And what's like heaps better than TCM. So what I did is, not everyone does this. So I'd been doing Chinese medicine for like 11 or 12 years or something. I didn't have a lot of patients taking herbs anyway, because I'd kind of moved just more towards acupuncture. But I had plenty of experience using herbs. I just didn't have a lot of patients on herbs at the time. And I came home from the course and I was like super excited about it. And I was like, okay, this is great. So what I started to do is, instead of patients being booked every half an hour, I started to space them out more, like what I did when I first started learning Chinese medicine. And that cost me money, because it means I couldn't see as many patients close together. But I was like, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to like sit there and actually like work this out in the 20 minutes where they're lying down having the acupuncture to work out what formula to give them according to this system. So I gave myself that extra time to be able to do that. And what I found was, even with the limited knowledge that I had of the ICEAM system, but because bear in mind, when you first start learning this, you learn a lot of theory stuff first, but you don't learn the pulse until you've done 3 sessions, 3 kind of weekends or 3 courses into it. So I would have had to have been doing it for a whole year before I'd have really learned the pulse. But I was kind of like keen, and I was like, I want to use this straight away. I want to try this out. And so I felt like, as a practitioner, you always try to do the best ethical thing you can. And what really sealed the deal for me as well was, after I started getting some good results with the limited knowledge I had of it, I thought this is more ethical for me to practice this than to do what I was doing before, right, with the 12 years of practice I'd done before with that stuff. Because what's also great about ICEAM is you've got a network of people that can support you. So I also had obviously my teacher Wade, who I could call and ask him stuff if I needed to. There's a massive forum of people, so you can write cases and ask about that, and provide anonymity to your clients. You're not breaching their confidentiality, but you're able to ask, questions to people all over the world that can kind of that have been doing it for much more time than you. And quite often other really well practiced teachers would answer your questions, and that kind of helps you along the way. And so I found, for me, I just jumped in straight away and did it. Other friends I know who started doing it, they were still clinging on to the TCM, not because they love TCM, but they just they wanted to feel confident in this. So they kind of left it for a few months or even a year before they started using the formulas. But for me, I just sort of drew a line in the sand and I said, right, I'm going to do this. If I'm going to do this, I better just start using it. So I actually chucked away all my TCM herbs. I wasn't tempted to give them all, to prescribe them. I scooped them all up and put them in the bin. I actually called a TCM person to pick them up because I gave them away. It's a charitable thing. Yeah.
You've already sort of hinted at this in talking about how the clinic, your clinic changed in terms of the appointment times, what you would go in and do whilst they were on the acupuncture table. Now, so that leads me to a sort of follow-up question, because these patients were accompanying you in a sense through this process, this transition from TCM to clinical to classical Chinese medicine. What can you tell us about? Was there a shift in relationship between you and the patient? What was their response, or what can you tell us about this transition from the patient?
Question, actually. What didn't change the amount of time the patients had to spend with me on their part, because normally as an acupuncturist, you often book people, I might book people every half an hour. The patients lie down in the room and then another patient comes in. So I was kind of using that time where they were still, so they didn't know any different. They didn't know I was sitting there sweating over my notes, trying to look for a formula for them. And it's just my nature. I'm a very confident person. Probably I know some of my patients do watch this channel. So surprise, that's what I was doing. But I'm honest with them. I said to them, look, I'm doing a new course. I'm doing something different. And especially with patients that hadn't taken herbs before and they were your regular acupuncture patients. So I would say to them things like, oh, look, there's a really great formula that could help you with this. And would you be interested in taking some herbs to treat this? And, I'm doing this new course and there's, some great herbs that would help with this. And that's what I'll say to them. And then they'd lie down on the table. And then I'm like, oh, what are those really great herbs that are going to help? I better fucking find them out in the next 20 minutes. Right. Now, something that probably TCM people don't understand, they wouldn't, how would you? Because you've not done this before, is within this system, a lot of the first things you give people is the easy part. Now, it's just how it is. I can't really explain exactly how that, because it would kind of belittle the system to kind of whittle it down to that. But what ends up happening is often people need what we call a harmonizing kind of formula. Not always, but often. So that in itself can make it a bit easier. So you can see a case, you can give them these herbs, and generally people either need that because that might be exactly what they need, or they need that before they're going to get to the other stuff that's going to come, like the tonification, if that's needed to do. And I've done a video on my channel before, what is harmonizing, right? And so that kind of whole thing, right, to explain what harmonizing is. But often if people need that, the formula for that is pretty simple. It's not that complicated. So when I was first starting to practice, that was kind of the first consult was kind of the easy one. And then when they went home, and I would be like, okay, I'm going to use these cases to kind of study this up more. So what else, what should come next for this kind of case, and so forth. sort of studying it like that. And I also had some patients where I didn't know what I was going to give them, and I did tell them, look, is it okay if I consult with my teacher about your case? And I've had several patients like that. One is, even now, sometimes I do that, and I might then, that's when I put it on the forum, and someone like Laurie or Arno or someone will answer it usually, and or some other students or practitioners who are really, really good will chime in, and that has been super helpful. And patients actually like that, because they think, oh, you're going to ask your teacher about me. Like they like that, right? They think.
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, we're having this conversation with you as sort of viewers, but we're also having this conversation with you as patients, which was the kind of conversation that we had with Laurie. And I think, like, as a patient, I would love that. Like, I would love knowing there's like a whole panel of experts kind of looking at me and be like, what's wrong with this person? Can you tell me, so that was like, this has been kind of a conversation about your patients in general. And I'm always really interested, because it seems to me like a difficult job to figure out what's wrong with somebody and then to give them something to help, because the human body is kind of complicated. And I just absolutely admire, I admire people who are capable of doing that. And then one of the things that I really like about your channel is that it also, it shows kind of a really solid grasp of what's happening if you can explain it to someone like me, so that I can understand, right?
Oh, thank you. That's good.
Oh, you're welcome. No, thank you. So I guess my question is, when was the time when you first had a sort of, you've had your TCM training and you're looking at a patient, and there's this moment where you're like, this would be something that would be very messy and complicated for me from a TCM perspective, but my God, like, now I feel like this is clear to me. You remember like having an experience like that?
Yes, lots of times. I thank Jesus for this method, because like it has helped a lot of people that I would have been confused about before. And I almost feel like I would have given them something anyway, because if someone comes in your door and I wouldn't have known any better, and I would have given, I would have done the best thing that I had thought of doing. And like, I mean, a good testament to that is that I have a lot of patients that I don't have to see anymore. Like they've gotten better. Like that's good. Like I've been able to discharge them and say, well, I don't need to see you anymore. And often this herb system, people end up on a constitutional formula where that's like right for them, and they may take that on and off as they need it, and you monitor that, manage that with them. And different practitioners do that in different ways. I kind of leave it to people to be autonomous themselves. Like, and I say, look, when that runs out, just call me if you need more and see how you go. I mean, I had a patient this week that just came in to pick up some herbs, and this is common where people often think, oh, the herbs aren't working. Like they'll call you up and say, oh, the herbs aren't working. You're like, oh, okay, no worries. Like, this is when they're first starting the treatment, and then you ask them some questions. So how's your sleep going? Oh yeah, so it's good now, like, or it's okay. I'm like, oh, so you're waking up like 3 times a night before, is that still happening? Oh no, that's not happening. Or like, people forget that their situation's improved, right? And it's good, because you shouldn't be focusing on all the bad stuff that's happened, right? But it happened this week where I had a patient like that, and she wasn't sure if the herbs were working or not. And this was also like a remote case that I've had. So she lives far away, and I've got I was able to feel her pulse the first time, but then it's kind of the rest of it's like, by phone and things like that. So you're posting herbs out. And when you do the posting out, you kind of want to be sure what you're giving them, because, it's a long, it's a long distance back and forward and all that. And, and she said to me something like, like the herbs had run out because of this postage situation, and I forgot to answer her message back. And so she'd gone a week without the herbs, and she said, oh look, I really noticed a difference when I didn't have the herbs, but when she was on the herbs, she didn't think anything much had changed. And that happens a lot for people. And they can then, this person had only been taking the herbs for a couple of weeks, right? So that's kind of normal, right? And that means their body still needs it, and you know, you can they can go on with it and have it as a maintenance thing. But often what happens is then people don't need it anymore, because this system is designed to treat people functionally, to make their body function better. So they shouldn't have to be living on Chinese herbs. It depends on what else people are doing. You know, if people want to booze it up every night and like treat their body terribly, then they probably will feel better keeping on taking herbs. But in general, like after a while, people don't need the herbs anymore. And I didn't really have that in TCM. I had patients leave the clinic, but they didn't leave because they were because they were better and they didn't need me anymore. They left because, you know, oh, this isn't working, so I'm moving on to something else, or, you know, they just fade away and you're not really sure what's happened. Like, I definitely know there's more of that in this now that I've used this system. Yeah, but to answer that first question, yeah, for sure. I can't recall exactly like the one patient, but there's been a few people where I've been like, it's a life-saving system, to be honest. Like, it's really designed for these acute, sometimes, like I had a patient recently who, and I get super excited, like nerded out a little bit when you feel a person's pulse. And you're like, oh, this might be a special one that I haven't given out this formula before. Like, and so I felt her pulse and it was really specific to this particular formula. And I was like, oh, I was so excited because I hadn't given that formula out just by itself before. And I was like, oh, she's, you know, and this is what's great about this system is like you have the pulse and then you have the symptoms, and she had, you know, the symptoms to match this pulse. And I was like, yes, like, you know, this could be it. Like, super excited. So I gave her the formula and I said to her, like, you know, this will either make you really, really better or you'll feel very worse, because it's one of those formulas. Like, you'll either feel like worse. And I said, if you do feel worse, like I always put my number on the bottle, you know, call me in a couple of days, you know, take it for a couple of days. If you feel worse, then I'll know exactly what that means and I can give you something else. But this is the best option. And that kind of a thing, I would never have had the clarity. One, I wouldn't have had the clarity of the feeling the pulse and knowing the formula. But secondly, I would never have used those kinds of herbs that can have that power. I just wouldn't have had the knowledge to do it and the skill to use it. So there's different kinds of herbs that are used in this system that are much more powerful than TCM herbs. Yeah.
So we've just touched a bit on pulse and the relationship between pulse and herb, right? In this last question, what could you tell us a little bit more about the Tien lineage pulse taking and how and what about it helped? So there is this connection between pulse and formula that you've just touched on. If you could go a little bit deeper into that would be great.
I can tell you, but I'll have to kill you.
That's classified. I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
No, we can talk in generic. So that is what is proprietary and unique, for one, about the system of what ICEAM teaches, that lineage pulse system. Yeah, that's what I can say about it.
So we don't need to really, I don't think, you know, we don't even really have the background knowledge to be able to understand what any of the stuff you would tell us would mean. I think Yassin is basically just asking, what about it was helpful to you clinically in general, in that way? Like, what did it help you cut through? What did it help pinpoint? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So the basis of the pulse diagnosis system, right, and this is any pulse system as well, is kind of like these three positions relate to different areas on your body, right? And Chinese medicine pulse diagnosis is one of, so there's a few things that make this like easier to implement and learn. One is you're being trained on using that system by the same teacher or teachers that are highly attuned to teach you what you're feeling. So when I went to TCM school, you would go into the student clinic, feel the pulse, and this happens now because I have students, I supervise student clinic, from time to time. I do that job as well. And students come back and say, oh, they had a wiry pulse and, had a wiry pulse, or, a weak pulse, or whatever they said. And then if no teacher goes and checks that pulse, how does the student know what they were feeling? How do they know it's a wiry pulse? And this is what had happened to me as a student, because just the way that, I'm not trying to blame my teachers, because that's how it was always taught. Yes, they were checking it, but there wasn't this, then you go and check it again. So how ICIM teaches it is, after you've done the pulse course, you then go and do pulse clinic days. So one of the supervising teachers will be there. So that might be someone like Laurie or Stephen or Anna or whatever. And the patients will come in, and these are all patients that have come from the practitioners that are doing the course as well. And so he'll feel the pulse, or she'll feel the pulse, and then the patient will go to the back of the room and they'll write up on the board or something, or tell you, they've got this and they've got that. This is all the different pulse that they have. And then you go and feel that. So you're feeling what he said is a wiry left guan. So then you cement that in your mind. You go, oh yeah, okay, now I know what that is. Now it doesn't just bing, bing, bing happen straight away. But no other system teaches it like that. I don't know. I don't think they do, because they're doing it by these ad hoc one-off courses and things like that, or on Zoom or something, or seminars. So that's kind of you don't have to do that training as part of the system, but you won't really learn the pulse unless you go and do those clinic training days. So that was a big game changer for me. And I tried to do as much of that as I possibly could. And he has this, they have this I don't know, tally sheet. You count up how many you've done, right? So I've done 150 or something like that pulses in those clinic days, I think, at least that. So you kind of clock up all these pulses. So that means you've calibrated what you feel against what your teacher has felt, right? That's part of it. The other part is the matching of the pulse qualities to herbs or herbal methods. Now, that's not completely unique to ICEAM, to the TN lineage, but it's pretty unique to that. There's some systems that use that, but this is a unique one. Yeah. So I'm not, to be honest, after I did this ICIM thing, I didn't feel the need to go and do a lot of other courses. So I don't know what every other course does. But there are some systems that use this idea of correlating feelings on the pulse to herbal, either one herb or a formula of herbs or things like that. And that's not just something that's been made up out of the air. That's something that is coming from Zhang Jing, it's coming from the Shanghan Lun, it's coming from the Jingwei, but then it's also coming from the lineage doctors in the system that have taught that and, been using that over the years.
How difficult was it for you just as a student? I've heard you talk before about how there's something systematic about the way the herbs are used, and there's less herbs, you've got a deeper knowledge of these herbs, and that's somehow very conducive to learning.
Yep.
How difficult was it though then to calibrate the pulse in that way? Is it some pulse systems are just very kind of complicated and are looking for very sort of subtle things, and it just takes forever? I'm thinking of at least one system that I have in mind, and I think most of them really are just a little vague and not precise in that way, or there's a very long distance between feeling that pulse and then reaching a diagnosis and then working things out. This in theory seems to be very helpful, because it goes straight to a formula, and because it just corresponds to certain things accurately in your experience. But how long does it take to learn? Is it a very complicated system, or is it a straightforward system that requires?
You'll learn it. The more pulse training days you can do as a student, the quicker you'll learn it. So I did more than other people that were learning up with not super more, but I made a point of doing that. So one of the people that is one of the guys in Australia, Simon Feeney, who has a massive herbs business in Port Macquarie, he'd organized like some kind of 5-day thing. So I went and did that. Like I made myself go and do like as much training that was there, I could do it. Like it's expensive as well. You can't just sort of, you have to do it within your means and your budget. But I kind of put all my effort into that in those 3 years. Now, unfortunately, then COVID happened and we haven't had any like in-person stuff all this time. Like it's coming back this year and I can't wait to kind of get back in the swim of it. But that has, I think if you just did this training online and you didn't do any pulse clinics with a teacher, I don't know how you'd learn it. I honestly don't know. Because especially if you've done TCM before, because you're thinking, because I had to wipe all that away from my memory. Like, and I noticed other students, because I'm very observant like this, and like when you're doing these pulse things, you'll be seeing other students do it and they're kind of like using their old system and like, oh, but we're not, in my mind, this feels like a slippery pulse, and they've been told it's a wiry pulse. And it's like, dude, just cancel that out of your mind now. You're here to learn this. Like, don't try to muck it up with that's what I'm thinking. I didn't say that. just keep my mouth shut and take my turn. But if people cling on to the old, and that's what I mean by it's hard for some practitioners to learn this, because they have to give away the other stuff in a way. Like you have to clear that out to make room for this and go, okay, I'm going to cement this in my mind that you've said this is a thin wiry pulse, so that's what it is, and I'm going to feel that, and I'm going to like learn that that's what it is. Now over time, if you don't keep doing the training, it's going to fade away. So I can't say how good I am right now. I'm not as good as I was 2 years ago because I haven't done those pulse days. I haven't been, I live in a really isolated city where there's no, like we were just literally locked away from the world by our government. Like we weren't allowed to leave for all that time. But you know what I mean? Like it's that's super important. And I've really missed kind of doing that. But I think if you do it, like I feel like I was very fortunate that I could do all that training, and then the COVID happened. I feel like if I was kind of halfway in it, and then the COVID happened, I might not have had such a reliance on myself. Now, the other thing that teaches you about this is, let's say you feel a pulse and you think that pulse corresponds to this formula. You give that formula and the patient gets better. Well, you must be right. So something's right there, and that's teaches you. Whereas if you give that formula and the patient's worse, and it's not because there are some tricky things where if one formula doesn't work, the opposite formula is what they need. There are a couple of those kinds of little things in there. But if that then happens and they're worse, well, then you might have been wrong. And that would be where I would go first. I wouldn't sort of I never blame the herbs. I'm not given the right formula. So if I gave the right formula for that pulse and they got worse on it, well, then I didn't feel the pulse correctly. That's how good the herbs are in that system. There are some pulse correlations that might have 2 or 3 permutations. Right. So it's like, that could be this formula, like it could have a few, but they'll be similar. They won't be like completely out of like so different. But there are some pulses that are like this, it's only this one thing and that's all that it is. And I really love those pulses because it's like you just feel good about yourself. Because you're going to feel that you're like, yes, I want a prize. Like it's only this one formula. And especially if a patient, like they have to have symptoms that match up with that. But when you feel a pulse and it's like pretty spot on with what you think, and then you ask them that one symptom, and that's another thing that's great about the system is you ask them that and you're like, oh, do you have like really, you probably feel it if you think they have cold hands, oh, do you have really freezing cold hands? Or, do you have a tightness kind of here? And they're like, oh yes, how did you know? And you're like, it's not magic. It's like the pulse is fitting that formula. And one of the symptoms in that formula would be that. And so you'd expect the patient would have that symptom. And you ask them, do they have it? And they're like, yeah, how did you know? I have it. Yeah.
Now, we've taken up a large chunk of your life at this point, for which we're grateful. I want to check if Yassin has a question to ask before I ask you a wrap-up question.
No worries.
More of a comment, Waleed, or an observation. It's in this last answer that you gave us, it's becoming increasingly clear to me not that it was unclear, but the extent to which, as you said, you have to clear out a certain set of knowledge and a certain set of ideas and a certain set of relationship to the pulse, relationship to herbs, that just it indicates to me, right, there's this, they ostensibly come from these two systems are ostensibly related. They come from the same region. They, right, there's so much that they ostensibly have in common, and yet there seems to be such a radical, they seem to be so radically different that would lead you as a practitioner who's had a clinical experience in both TCM and classical Chinese medicine to make that observation that no, you have to clear this out of your head and use this set. And I find that very interesting, the extent to which, because that's very interesting. I mean, that clear out, that's quite, I mean, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So more comment just from that last. Yeah.
Well, something my teacher said to me, Wade, when he was my first teacher in Chinese medicine. He said, look, you have two hats. You have your TCM hat. This is we're learning Chinese medicine. You have your Chinese medicine hat and you have your Western medicine hat. Because at the same time you're in college, you're learning, the Krebs cycle and this and that, you know. And he's like, you need to take that hat off and put your Chinese medicine hat on, because if you're always trying to learn Chinese medicine and you're thinking, but what about my thyroid? Or what about my pancreas? And you're like, where is that in Chinese medicine? He's like, you're never going to properly learn this system. You just kind of have to keep them separate. And then once you really learn the TCM, and you've probably by that stage learned the Western medicine, you can kind of almost like you've come to that point where you can sit back and think about things, how they relate to each other. But at the time when you're learning, it's very confusing. So I kind of approached the classical Chinese medicine like that, where I cleared away, I like put my TCM hat off, but I've never put that hat back on again. Just kind of left it on the shelf somewhere.
So when we were talking about like this like imperialist moment on your channel here, you at one point just we were having a general conversation, getting to know each other, and you just casually kind of said, oh yeah, this whole thing like with classical Chinese medicine has changed my life. And it has never, like, since it's been like a week now or something, and I've been thinking about that. Why did you say that? I think that will be my last question, and it gives you a chance to just kind of give whatever your experience was as somebody who learned it. What did you mean?
Well, when something's really, I mean, Chinese medicine is almost my whole life. Like it's not completely my whole life, but I've always done this. I've done it since I was 17 years old. And I remember doing the classical system, the first 2 or 3 sessions, thinking, this is what I thought I was learning back in TCM time. I thought that's what we were being taught. Like we were being taught that, you're going to be able to functionally like restore somebody's function. And that's, it's not about treating the disease. But then, I don't know, it just didn't do that. And I remember thinking, I wish this is what I had learned then. Like this just makes so much sense to me. And it just kind of clicked to me. And I was like, it just felt right. Also, look, for me at that time, I was kind of getting bored with Chinese medicine. I'd had run my business for 12 years. I'd been going to China a lot. I had a retail shop in clothing and homewares at the same time, because I'm this kind of person that needs a lot of like stuff happening to keep me occupied and entertained. And I just got to the point with my practice where I was seeing lots and lots of back pain people, and I loved helping them with that stuff, but it wasn't like that interesting to me. I love puzzles and doing something hard where I feel like that was hard work. I need that. Like I don't want it to be all the time every day, but the challenge, what I love about this system that has changed my life is because it's given me a system that I know that if I learn it properly, I can solve the problem. Like, whereas with TCM, it was like always like, the knowledge is just, I just don't know it. Something else I have to find the, whereas the knowledge is here. I just have to properly understand it better. I need to study it more. I know that it's there. I know it's within the reach of it. you know, with TCM, you always think, oh, buy the latest book. Oh, who's this? What's this person saying about this? You know, you're kind of chasing the latest trend of it kind of thing. And you don't kind of need to do that with this. And look, it's just made me happier. And the other thing is with ICIM, I've just met a lot of other nice people, really, really nice people in Chinese medicine that I didn't meet in the other parts of Chinese medicine. I'm not sure what it's like in where other people are, but in Australia, there's a lot of dog eat dog people. Just like they're jealous of people. They're not for, they're just, I don't know, like, can you like, just let's all just get along and be, you know, that we don't have to fight like our kung fu schools are fighting with each other all the time for who's the best sifu or something, you know. Whereas I just found all the people that I'd met for the most part through ICIM, because you go to these trips there regularly, like you're going to, like you're traveling or you're taking a lot of time out to do the courses. And, you know, even people that I've met that have done it online, they've got the same kind of mindset, and it's just something different about people, and such lovely people. And you just kind of find that there's that common ground, and that has been lovely for me. But just feeling more confident in the clinic, getting the results and feeling passionate, because I was like ready to, like, if I didn't do ICM, I probably would have quit Chinese medicine to pursue my other entrepreneurial things that I was interested in. I was thinking, oh, make a franchise store, or, you know, I don't know, like I needed that challenge, and it came along at the right time and gave me the challenge. And you know, it's and the other thing is it gives you the tools to treat really difficult cases that like some of these people they need it and they're desperate, and like I like to be able to help people. And it's just such a great medicine. It's such a great, like I used to work in run a homeless food van, for instance. And I had a guy that was coming there, and he had extreme diarrhea from eating food off the street, and just like a food point, but he had this diarrhea for like a week. And what's great about the system is I didn't have to do a whole fancy intake or anything like that. I said to him, look, and this is when I was first starting to learn it, so I was keen to feel any pulses I could feel, right? I said to him, look, I'm just starting to learn this new system of herbs. Would you be okay if I felt your pulse, and I'll see if there's any herbs I've got, I'll bring them for you next time. And I was going to see him in 2 days. So I felt his pulse, and again, bang, it was like spot on to something I could think of. And it was just a simple formula. And all I'd done is so he didn't need to disclose any other information to me. He just said, I've got diarrhea, I felt his pulse, here's your herbs, bang. So that's probably the best example I could give you.
Well, that's a beautiful thing. And like I said, I mean, we're not practitioners, so like the amount of suffering people have is different, but I think we can all sort of relate to this sense of relief when somebody can actually help you, you know. So that really beautiful thing. Okay, Yassin, would you like to ask anything, or should we wrap it up?
I think we can wrap it up. Yeah, I think that's a good story to end on.
I think it is. Yeah. Marie, thank you so much for letting us just ask you these questions directly. Otherwise, we would have been in your comments section for the next year and a half.
No worries. This was very fun. This was great.
Yeah, we really enjoyed it. Yeah. Thank you.